So this is the third part of three sections, kind of this overview of legislation, litigation, and to me, giving a foundation to some of the elements that we'll expand upon when it comes to why we have special education and the basic elements of special education, and again, the connections between what's happening in something that legislation-wise continues to live, continues to breathe, continues to be modified, etc. Now, we talked about the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, and we talked about it briefly enough to give you, I believe, somewhat of a foundation. And we'll expand more when we meet again face to face. But there's an element that we at least need to introduce before we meet face to face, and that is Section 504. In Section 504, because we're mentioning it, we also need to mention the Americans with Disabilities Act. Now, Section 504 is an element that, well, I'm not sure if this visual does it justice, and I apologize for some of the, by making it larger, it gets a little blurry. It's not my visual, but I like it. And that is Section 504 is the blue part of this overall circle. See, IDEA includes the individuals that we mentioned just a moment ago and that we'll expand upon this semester. But there's a number of individuals that you may have looked at, including individuals with ADHD, that you might have thought about and said, wait a minute, I don't see like dyslexia there. I don't see other disabilities that I thought I was aware of. What about some of these mental health things of that nature? Well, there are disabilities that are not necessarily included in IDEA, therefore, that are not federally required under the same components, an individual education program, the parental participation, the due process, that they still need guidance, they still need additional support. And those are what would be referred to as Section 504. So that's that blue line. And then inside that big circle, all children, of course, are in the circle itself, and the red area would be, the rest of the students that are not seen as having a disability. Now, Section 504 is critical, and let's kind of move into really specifically. So IDA, by the circle itself, represents a smaller group of individuals. Now, historically, that's about, depending upon the school district, 13 to 14% of your overall population would have disabilities that would allow them to be eligible for services under IDEA. Now, you may have a larger group, another group of individuals that, yes, they have disabilities, thus they're, there, but they aren't eligible for IDEA. Instead, they're eligible for what would be referred to as Section 504. Now, what is Section 504, Sean? Well, Section 504 is a piece of legislation passed in 1973, and knowing the history element of this is critical, but I'll give you a little overview. See, in 1973, they passed something called the Rehabilitation Act. And in it, there was a number of elements, including the definition of individuals with disabilities and the fact that you can't discriminate against those individuals. Think of it about as 10 years later from the civil rights legislation when they were trying to do something that if you're involved federally in terms of money or receiving money or work for the federal government, etc., that you can't discriminate due to disabilities. The challenge with that piece of legislation was that when it was passed by Congress, and if we remember our U.S. government, the executive branch would then enforce it, offer clarity, regulations, etc. And they were slow on the uptake. President Nixon initially kind of ignored it. President Ford ignored it to a degree. President Carter even ignored it to a degree. But basically, as the 70s progressed, elements of Section 504 and elements of the Rehabilitation Act were clarified, and other elements were kind of not necessarily forgotten, but definitely lack of clarity, therefore lack of implementation. Well, then the 80s come along, and there's this need for clarity in certain areas. And I mentioned ADHD in our last video, and I mentioned how ADHD as a category for IDEA was not included, and that's true, and it's not. But what came of this was, wait a minute, these individuals have a disability. They're defined in the Diagnostic Statistic Manual, DSM, as we mentioned in an earlier presentation. So they're defined in DSM, and they are, therefore, ADHD is a group. Their disability, it's actually initially defined as ADD, and then we've added in hyperactivity. But anyways, where it's going is that by the early 1990s, okay, we're not going to be included IDA, but what about this Section 504? And so during the 90s, we have clarity about what 504 is. We have clarity about what it's going to look like. And here, the actual law itself basically says this: no otherwise qualified individual with a disability shall, solely by the reason of their disability, be excluded from participation or denied benefits or be subjected to discrimination if this entity that they are interacting with receives federal financial assistance. What does that mean, Sean? Well, first of all, federal financial assistance, public schools. Any public school cannot, due to individuals' disability, discriminate them and exclude them from participation in school, that would be the benefits, learning benefits, etc., or be subjected to discrimination, and that could be everything from how they're perceived, treated, etc., if this entity is receiving federal financial assistance. And you're saying, Sean, it's not only public schools, but it's colleges too, isn't it, Sean? Because federal financial aid, etc. Yes, you are totally correct. But let's focus on our K through 12 schools first. So Section 504 basically says any individual with a disability, well, that's why it includes all of IDEA. But see, IDEA is much more specific, and IDEA is much more specific to individuals with disabilities. And in terms of what they're going to get, they're going to get much more unique, specially designed instruction. 504 is a little bit more global. So first of all, 504, when it's global, it doesn't define the different categories as I mentioned in the last presentation. They just go global. And that, first of all, anyone that has a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more other person's major life activities. Well, Sean, major life activities, we'll get at that in just a second. Has a record of such an impairment, meaning that they actually, some sort of record that they've been diagnosed with, all right? Or is regarded to have such an impairment. What do you mean by regarded? Well, an individual with a broken leg would be seen as having a physical impairment. Do they have history with that? No, but temporarily they very well may have a physical impairment. Do they get support due to their temporary physical impairment? Actually, yes, they do. Well, let's get this in terms of major life activity. So major life activity focuses on elements of functions such as caring for oneself, performing manual tasks, and the big thing here is learning. So walking, seeing, hearing, speaking, breathing, learning, and working. So 504 then says that first of all, you can't exclude and discriminate them. And so then 504 gets a little deeper and says, well, we cannot provide you an individual education plan. We cannot provide you with that specifically element. But we can provide you with reasonable accommodations. So what 504 is all about is reasonable accommodations. Well, what would some reasonable accommodations be, Sean? Well, what if I have issues due to attention, ADHD, that have major concerns that takes me much longer to take a test. Therefore, in a timed test, I'm not being assessed so much in my knowledge, I'm being assessed in my inability to focus, pay attention, therefore the time it takes me to take the test. Could I have some additional time? That would be an accommodation, reasonable accommodation. What if I need a quiet space due to my distractions? So maybe when I take a test, I go down to a quieter room. Due to this, again, defined, identified, and I have a history of this disability. Well, okay, that would be a reasonable accommodation. What if I have a test read to me due to some of my reading concerns? Sure, that would be a reasonable accommodation. What if you totally changed the test and gave me an A and I don't have to take the test? That's not a reasonable accommodation. So 504 is just simply allowing individuals that would be in the general education classroom to get some additional support when needed and within the parameters of what's be appropriate. We're not asking teachers to alter what they do instructionally. We're not asking teachers to change what they do in terms of, okay, we have this expectation, but 504 students, we don't have that expectation. No, we have that expectation, but we may give some accommodations to support you in the challenges you currently have. All right, so, and by the way, it is not a special education focus, meaning we don't have the IEP, we don't have the special education teacher. This is a general education initiative. This is something that the general education teachers would meet and support, and we'll get into great detail. 504 plans is what they're called when we get into the individual education plan or the IEP. So we'll talk about those things. All right, so that's kind of just an overview of 504, just to kind of make you aware of it. The Americans with Disabilities Act, we'll actually wait a bit and talk about that when we meet face to face. So this is the end of the third part of the 3 parts overview of history and legislation and litigation when it comes to some of the evolution elements of what we deem as special education and how we support individuals with disabilities in our pre-K through 12 environments. I alluded to post-secondary, we will get to that. And of course, we mentioned birth to 3, we will get to that as well. Have a great day.